Why talk about resilience? Because this ultimately, whether you know it or not, is the big kahuna. This is what you're aiming for. I mean, you're not aiming for particularly resilience. You're aiming for somebody to get a job and a family and to act as if this has been, the schizophrenia is a annoyance and inconvenience, something that is there, but they deal with it while they go on to, with the rest of their life as they see it. That's what you're really in here for. You might not think about that all the time because on the short term, day to day, a lot of is with just dealing with symptom management. Like I have psychosis, I have paranoia, and trying to address specific symptoms on a short term is most of our day to day work. But we do this in service of a bigger goal of fostering, a big and meaningful recovery. We're having a technical difficulty. Okay, yet if we think about all people you have in your caseload, some of them are going to achieve those very high levels of recovery, and some are going to do not so hot. And so you may ask yourself then, what accounts for these differences? And resilience is one of those factors. So resilience is a factor which can make the difference between getting better and getting really, really well. So that being the case, I think it's worthwhile to look at resilience as a thing. So as we're going to talk about resilience, then let's just talk about what actually we mean. So resilience it comes to us from Latin words. Salire is the word for jumping or bouncing, and resalire is to bounce back. And so that's where we get, and for the medical people, salire is the root word for saltatory, which means jumping. And so it basically means the ability to bounce back or to recover from being stretched or to come back to some form of equilibrium, or to recover from setbacks or adversity. It's very interesting in that it's kind of a hot topic in psychology, yet the psychologists haven't come up with a unified operational definition of it. So the definitions that exist revolve around the ability of bouncing back or restoring equilibrium, but it's not been officially codified. So why is it? We're going to go to slide number 6 probably now. Yeah. So why study resilience in schizophrenia? Well, as I said, it's one factor that can lead to better outcomes, and I'm not the only one who believes this. The NIH believes this also, as they incorporated resiliency training as a core component of coordinated specialty care in the Navigate model during their RAISE study. A long-term follow-up of people with schizophrenia who had a very significant recovery identified resilience as one of the factors which correlated with higher levels of outcome. And not only, correlation doesn't prove causation, but mediation of an effect comes closer to that. And resilience was found to be a mediating element between stigma and functioning. So to the extent that I think, I've got this disease, I'm screwed, resilience seems to moderate that so that you can go from an initial setback to, and now I'm going to just deal with this and overcome it. So, it seems to be a thing. And on the converse, lower level of resilience corresponds with some worse levels of some symptoms in schizophrenia. So resilience seems to be a thing. So how do we get it? What is resilience made out of? And, our psychology colleagues have done a lot of work on this, and there's a whole bunch of what I call, stuff that's not in one's control. So whether you're brought up with a certain belief system, whether you have economic advantages or disadvantages, whether you're exposed to high levels of trauma or not as a kid, those are some things that relate to resilience, but we're not going to focus on those. For those interested, we're going to send out a PDF of the slides and all these little hyperlinks. They actually go to the primary literature. So this one you can click on and get to an open access paper, which will talk about these environmental and social determinants of resilience. We're instead going to focus on internal or personal factors because those are theoretically modifiable. And actually more than theoretically. because any belief is modifiable. Let's move on then to the, oh, that's me. Next slide. So what are the factors then? What are the personal factors that can contribute to resilience? And the ability to make plans and carry them out, having a higher level of self-esteem or confidence in oneself, or positive view of one's strengths and abilities. Skill in being able to communicate or in solving problems, and the ability to be aware of emotions and to regulate them. One or more of these factors might be affected in the short term by somebody who's experiencing an acute episode of psychosis, but it's not negated. And oftentimes, although one or two might be attenuated in the moment, the others will still exist, and they bounce back themselves. So, these are the building blocks that a client or a therapist working with a client can use to then, work on building resilience. So how to actually, oh, I'm sorry, I missed one. So I did miss one. That was actually out of order. But to talk about, again, the relevance of resilience to schizophrenia, a very interesting study was done where they recruited individuals who self-identify as having had a fairly good level of recovery and having fairly good control of symptoms. And they asked them in interviews to just comment around resilience. And so a theme emerged from these interviews that said that for people affected by schizophrenia, resilience was actually really an act of, taking control of the illness, which then necessarily meant that they had to have an acknowledgement of the setback. So it was this interesting dynamic, because you have to, acknowledge and feel a loss by having experiencing this illness and these symptoms. But at the same time, then one's acceptance takes in then a determination to deal with it. So making a decision to tackle challenges rather than back away from them. You'll see in another slide is more than one group have identified that as a key factor toward building resilience. So, how to improve resilience? Let's listen to the psychologists. And again, that's hyperlinked, and it's going to be clearer in this PDF you get. But creating and building social relationships. So social engagement. You're going to see cognates in first episode work, coordinated specialty care with this. So working on relationships, crucial. Relationships can be both with therapists and practitioners, as well as with peers and family. Avoiding seeing crises as insurmountable problems. So yes, you have an illness, and yes, these symptoms are very bothersome. These are things that we can deal with. We can find you medicines that will help to negate them. We can find you therapies that will further help to negate them, and you can be like so many others and overcome this, and we'll help you, show you the way. Accept that change is part of living. This relates again to seeing crisis, the shift of perception of crisis. So with respect to, well, in this particular bullet point, when a setback happens, a resilient move is to see this as, gosh, this is bad, but this isn't the end of everything. This is that right now I'm this far behind, but I don't have to be this way for all of time. So focus on, rather than focus on the current deprivations, focus on the elements that you can grab to then change things. With the idea of trying to change things, it's helpful to set goals that are realistic and achievable, and doing things in small steps. So if I had developed schizophrenia when I was entering medical school, I might say, I'm going to be a doctor, damn it, and this is how I'm going to do it. And the ability to succeed in 4 years, not realistic, but if I then modify my curriculum to make it 7 years, I might actually be able to do it. So a lot of people, if they have a major setback like this, are going to say everything is lost. And maybe the time frame or maybe the scale is not attainable in the degree to which you'd imagined, but breaking it down and tackling it in a logical fashion makes it actually doable. Yeah, this is what people do. So related to that, taking action, like doing things that move you toward wellness rather than not. Looking for opportunities to grow, nurturing positive view of self, keeping things in perspective, reiterating stuff I've talked about earlier, and maintaining a hopeful outlook. I'm inclined during a future lecture to revisit the Hippocratic Oath or the Hippocratic dictum. First, do no harm. I'm going to suggest that in mental health, first establish hope. The most harmful thing that you can do is to say, "Oh gosh, you're really screwed," or to imply things like, "Oh my gosh, you have this really spooky illness," and to react as if this is somehow you can't have the luxury of panicking, even if you might be worried. You cannot discern. You cannot let that go through your facial expressions or body language. So, because when you can do the most harm by at the beginning saying, communicating through body language, verbal language, anything, that I'm really pessimistic about your outlook. Rather, establishing hope, I think, should be rule number one in engaging anybody for the first time. It's also found that one can build resilience through looking towards faith, engaging in meditation, or doing spiritual practices. So these are what the American Psychological Association has digested from the world's literature and put for the public. They're all very good points. They haven't been specifically tested in schizophrenia, but there's really no reason why they didn't work. To the extent that stuff has been looked at schizophrenia, to the extent that things have been specifically studied in schizophrenia, the body of research is smaller, but it's still on par with the same things that work for people without. Look at what the NIH did in the Navigate model. To improve resilience, they incorporated a cognitive behavior therapy orientation, which is all about reframing, acknowledging this happens, but let's look at it through different ways and choose the one that is maybe more realistic. And generally, the realistic way of looking at something is a lot less awful than the initial one. So I have schizophrenia, oh my God, my life is over. Let's look at this. You have schizophrenia, yes, but what's the evidence that says your life is over? I mean, you're here today. Look at all these people who are getting better. Look, here's a plan to help you get better. So maybe it's fair to say you have an illness now, but you can make it better by engaging in treatment. And even if you did nothing, it might get better just with time. So, looking at that, that's what they mean by CBT orientation. It's related to second point, education. Because the more you know, the less you need to be fearful, and then using things to enhance motivation. So those are the elements that NIH suggested as useful for improving resilience. Interestingly, I think they largely borrowed it from the non-psychotic literature because there's not a whole lot in schizophrenia per se that would have necessarily informed those practices. Self-pacing. So rather than me finishing medical school in 4 years, I'm going to try to make it in 8. Makes my stress level down and makes me more likely to win. And building self-esteem. So these are all things that you already do and you can continue to do. I'm just letting you know if you do these well, you're going to work. It's going to work. And by the way, I just want to say one thing also on self-pacing. I don't want this illness to bring me down. I want to go and achieve this goal. I'm going to do it in a year. I'm likely to fail and have a setback. So you need to, when talking with somebody about their goals, you need to set them up so that you can have small wins every day. I say win early, win often. So if you set goals that you can achieve like tomorrow, the next day, and it can be to the beginning as simple as getting out of bed and changing clothes, put a check mark in the box, put a star on the poster, put a high five, whatever you need to do, celebrate the reward. That's a win, especially if for the past 3 weeks, you didn't even do any of that. And then build from there. So the more success begets success. And if we help people, find where they're at and set up a task that they can win at, then they can keep winning and then they can, gradually win bigger. So win early, win often. Okay, again, to bonus material, or related to the idea of the first thing you do is establish hope. what is the prognosis with schizophrenia? The field is in disarray. I mean, some leading figures in schizophrenia research will go on conferences and say, real schizophrenia is a horrible illness and only 10% get better. Yet those people, those prognoses are actually at odds with data like this. Actually, a whole bunch of data like this. Look at all these studies from various years. These are fairly big samples, between 100 and 500 individuals. And over the long term, recovery being the goal, not necessarily I'll never have hallucinations again, but meaningful life, then the recovery figures actually look really good. Recovery is the normal outcome. And, back in 1973, they did that with hardly anything. And they did that with very little knowledge and very little medication options, and yet they were able to get, they came up with high levels of recovery. So, patience and winning big, winning early and often, and staying the course, and not freaking out with this is a horrible disease. Actually, if you just do good enough, you're going to get recovery. And if you do evidence-based practice, incorporating pharmacotherapy, psychotherapy, environmental, family, and social supports, and if you can intervene at early stages of illness, these numbers on the far right column are extraordinarily realistic, and they may be underestimates, who knows. So this other study, Glynn, it's the same study, hyperlinked in this slide, same citation. Those researchers went out and recruited a bunch of people with schizophrenia who seemed to have very high levels of recovery. And they interviewed and they tried to understand, what are some common factors that are associated with those levels of recovery, hope, redefining self. So rather than I'm a person who's broken, it's I'm a person who has a few glitches in my integration of sensory information, and this is doable. Incorporating the illness again, rather than saying rather than running away, saying I have this and I'm going to deal with it in the following ways, probably explains how it can be associated with better recovery. Meaningful activities, because human beings are wired for meaning and purpose. If we're not engaged in stuff that every day is in line with our meaning and our purpose, we feel horrible. We're genetically programmed to do this because we grew up in tribes or small clans in which every single person has a role. We're social animals and we have to have a role toward a greater good. So having activities that are meaningful, that a person sees as adding value to society or entities bigger than oneself, that's in our DNA. So it's no surprise to me that meaningful activities and purpose keeps coming up as a signal for associations with higher levels of recovery. What else? Overcoming stigma, assuming control of illness, becoming empowered. Notice all these things are stuff that are modifiable. If you don't currently have it, you can do it. And then to drive home, on conclusion, to drive home this idea that this is something that we don't have to then throw up our hands. Oh, it's Karen again. Look, I guess we're just going to do this thing. I think a lot of the pessimism comes from decades of reactive practice and decades of practice in the dark where we knew very little about what's going on with this illness. And it's led to this idea that schizophrenia is a chemical imbalance or a medical disease, and that the treatments you need is external, is like medication. And so the message seems to be, as I hear it, you have a disease, you have a medical disease, you need medical treatment, but unfortunately we don't understand all that much about the disease. So let's just trial and error the medicines to see whether it puts the individual who's suffering in a position of passivity or a disempowering position. But bullet point number 3, half of what causes schizophrenia has nothing to do with biology. Why do I say this? Because if this is my identical twin, and I'm going to make my identical twin he, if my identical twin has schizophrenia, I share exactly 100% of his DNA, yet my risk for schizophrenia is 50%. So genes don't determine everything. Genes determine half. The other half of what causes schizophrenia is that we're not really quite sure. It revolves, one signals around stress, and broadly we call it environment. So stress, certain kinds of drugs, and we're still figuring out toxoplasmosis. We don't really know for sure, but it's not genes. So genes are not destiny. And if half of what causes illness are stuff that is, environmental, social, or psychological, that's half that I theoretically have control over. So if my twin has developed schizophrenia, I can probably enhance my, chances for not getting it by paying very close attention to all these facets of my environment. And so that's in causality. In what determines outcome, again, a lot of the stuff is stuff that we have control over. So do I use marijuana or amphetamines or no? Do I try to do medical school in 3 years, or do I maybe go for a physician assistant in 7 years? Do I kind of gauge my stress level? Can I gauge my diet? Can I engage disengage from people who are toxic, re-engage with people who are helpful? Do I stay in bed because that's what I feel like doing, or do I challenge that urge and then I go out and engage the world? All these things are actually highly relevant to outcomes and are in the control of an individual. So, establishing a sense of control, acknowledging the setback, but taking action against it are things that relate mightily to resilience. And that's why I want to conclude with these comments. And final bullet point, we tend to think that we tend to think of our ideas as something that we are passive recipients of. Actually, as I think you all know, I'll just reemphasize this: we have control over what we believe, whether we feel it or not. If I'm currently a Democrat and I really want to be a Republican, I can eventually convince myself to getting at least halfway there. And if I'm currently see myself as a person who's destined to fail, I can get myself at least halfway. I can get myself probably to the point where, well, I might not fail like I imagine I'm going to, and I can get some of the way to, and I might succeed in some things. So we have the ability to change our beliefs all times and every places. So helping people, reminding you that you know this, helping your clients know that they can do this, again, is another factor which is modifiable. And these, non-biological, environmental, psychological, social factors that we can control relate mightily to resilience, and will, I think, be, good tools in helping people to achieve their highest level of function, comfort, satisfaction, meaning, and purpose in life. So that's all my comments on this.